Hola, comrades. Today's topic of interest, Impressionism. More than stunning natural landscapes or an emphasis on light and movement, Impressionism is an ethos. Though its roots can be traced to a specific time and place, France in the latter half of the 19th century, it's not tied to that setting in the same way that, say, postmodernism is tied to the era immediately after the Second World War. Nevertheless, analyzing the roots of the movement can elucidate its nature. Impressionism was born from a rejection of the realist stylings that were popular in the first half of the 19th century, when the glory and grandeur of the French Revolution gave way to more sobering analysis on social conditions. The focus was on ordinary French citizens. This was a time in French history where art that was not striving to be realistic had to be about mythical scenes, and even many of those mythical scenes were created with traditional Greek dedication to realism. With France constantly on the verge of slipping again into revolution, nationalism and social critiques were dominant themes. However, the Impressionists made a different path for themselves. Against what was considered sensible in contemporary French society, they argued that a landscape could be best captured not by including every last detail, but by conveying the emotions evoked by the landscape. Though the term was originally used as an epithet by a harsh critic of the movement, it was quickly adopted by the artists themselves. One could even argue the moment the term was coined was the moment the movement coalesced from a disparate series of individual painters into a collective whole. The conditions that led to the development of this movement may have faded, but the central idea of the movement remains prevalent. Impressionism does not create a world distinct from reality, as does fantasy. It does not imbue an otherwise non-magical world with magical elements for the purpose of exaggerating and heightening and clarifying tensions and conflicts, as does magical realism. Rather, Impressionism is an argument about the nature of reality itself. It is the statement that the true essence of reality cannot be explained by mere facts, but by emotions. It is the statement that only depicting facts provides nothing but a shallow husk of reality. In a world where fact-checking has become an accepted form of journalism and politicians on both sides jockey to be seen as the most factual, the idea of facts not being sufficient to convey truth seems audacious, even transgressive, but it has nonetheless spread from French painting in one particular era to all over the world. The movement is still connected strongly with France, and many of the non-painters who are considered Impressionists are French, such as the composer Debussy and the writer Baudelaire. However, the Impressionist ethos lasted and suffused around the world because it offered an alternative to myths and science and realism. It provided a worldview that was wholly artistic. 20th century modernist writer Virginia Woolf may not have been as directly inspired by Monet and Manet as she was by psychology to inspect and analyze the many undulations and digressions of how the mind perceives reality, but her work is nonetheless impressionistic. She rejected the idea that there is a hierarchy of intrigue, i.e., that battles and bloodshed are necessarily more worthy of artistic attention than dinner parties and drawing rooms. Recognizing this hierarchy as sexist, she sought to overturn it by focusing on the depths of emotion lying beneath the surfaces of her characters. She was less interested in what these characters did or said, or even what thoughts prompted them to do or say these things, than in what sensations flooded these characters. She was more interested in their lived experience than what they'd said or did with that experience. In her work, the latter categories are but leaves. The experience itself is the tree. The focus is not on the facts, but on the impression. The facts are filtered through the character's perceptions into vivid, visceral majesty. In Mrs. Dalloway, the entire narrative takes place over the course of a single day. The titular character prepares for a massive supper party it is her duty to throw, and by day's end, she throws it. By the old traditional conventions of literature, this should be a boring and mundane story, but instead it's enthralling, and the reason why is Impressionism. The facts themselves are nothing but the shell. Woolf elevates the material to the level of all-time classic literature by focusing on the reactions the characters have to even the most ostensibly mundane aspects of their environment, and where these reactions take them. Mrs. Dalloway's mind wanders, and she finds herself overtaken by old memories and hopes and ideas. The characters are only partially cognizant of the experiences they're having. If a character's thought process is like moonlight shining through clouds, Woolf is less interested in the moonlight itself than in how that light tinges the clouds. Beneath Mrs. Clarissa Dalloway's consciousness is an abyss of sensations she is unable to admit even to herself. That is, until death intrudes upon her dinner party and crumbles the facade of normalcy. She can no longer pretend that the version of herself who follows accepted convention is the only version of herself that exists. All the different versions of her burst to the surface. Throughout the novel, her narrative has been paralleled with that of Septimus Smith, a World War I vet suffering heavily from PTSD. Eventually, Septimus kills himself, and the news of this is what slices through Clarissa's facade. Woolf was obsessed with World War I and studied how she believed it changed the very spirit of European society. It is the center around which many of her works are shaped, most notably To the Lighthouse. Her feelings on the effects of the war are mixed. In her acclaimed feminist polemic, A Room of One's Own, she speaks of how it carried off a whole era of European tradition, and with it, a certain way of thinking about the world. As this old order was restrictive, she does not wish it back, but she does mourn it. Woolf acutely sensed how completely World War I had destroyed Europe's conception of itself, while leaving it diminished by slaughtering a generation of young men. Clarissa had been isolated from this continent-shaking trauma, and because of this, she had been able to act as though the old ways and customs were still extant. She was able to suppress somewhat her contemplations about how her life could have gone, because the old order never allowed for those possibilities. However, when she is shaken by the news of Septimus's death, and the war and the ending of this age intrude into her dinner party, she is struck by a revelation, and revelations are perhaps where Woolf's impressionistic stylings most effulgently shine. Woolf was an atheist mystic. She believed in transcendent experiences, but she did not believe they were bestowed by a great supernatural force. Rather, she believed that they occurred when interaction with the world spurs feelings that lead one to a discovery. According to Woolf, this is not a natural, logical process. It is miraculous, but there are no supernatural forces involved. Instead, everything that was blurry snaps into view, and behind the curtain of ignorance lies supernal wisdom. At least for a moment, life is illuminated. The benefits of the impressionistic perspective here are clear. If this sort of revelation were done without Impressionism, a character would simply go from not knowing something to knowing something, and that there would be no drama, no tension, and no narrative. As there is no logical basis to this kind of transformation, it would be ludicrous if logic and facts were prioritized. However, when one's experience and impression are prioritized, with the how ranking above the what and even the why, the descriptions of how this revelation affects Clarissa are sublime. Suddenly, the gap between the conscious and subconscious is dissolved. Consciously, she is finally forced to admit how detached this life she is living is from what she considers important and meaningful. Even those who are not directly trying to use Impressionism's powers can succeed because of them. Yes, this is where Carly Rae Jepsen enters the picture. In 2015, Carly Rae Jepsen released Emotion, one of the best pop albums of all time. For years, I was confused as to why this shimmery album captivated me, but eventually I was able to discern the answer was Impressionism. The bright, shiny 80s-esque pop hooks of that album are infectious. My love for those requires no explanation. Taylor Swift's 1989 is perhaps a purer evocation of the 80s, and that half of it is completely misguided and nonsensical, but Emotion is how nostalgic kids imagine the 80s being. All pastels and flash and huge grooves, and a sense of openness and grandiose romantic intimacy they believe is missing from the music of today. However, my love of the lyrics took longer for me to explain. They're quite basic on first glance. Compared to the sugary childishness of Call Me Maybe, they're basically Faulkner, but they're still, on first impression, basic songs about love and relationships. On first impression, they don't expand beyond their premises, but the songs nonetheless soar because of the impressions they make. Their lyrical content evokes more than what it directly entails. This is partially because of Carly Rae Jepsen's emotive, aching vocal performances, but mostly it has to do with how perfectly she can suggest without having to directly state. Take the album's standout track, Run Away With Me, for example. In the pre-chorus, she sings, "'Cause you make me feel like I could be driving you all night, and I'll find your lips in the street lights." Overtly, there's nothing complicated here, but she nonetheless manages to evoke a luscious scene of excitement and mystery and danger and a presumed breaking of a dissatisfying status quo. She does not have to explain why she wants this person to run away with her, or how she felt before she met them. All of that is gloriously implied. The lyrics don't directly construct the whole picture, but they convey the whole picture. All the ecstatic, spirit-lifting passion, all the fearlessness, all the delirium, it's wonderful. In the bridge, she sings, "Over the weekend, we can turn the world to gold," which ought to dampen the drama by shrinking the stakes, but instead exacerbates the dizzying desire for every moment to be forever. And the bombast is so thunderously unyielding that it feels profound. It feels like she could make every moment last forever. It feels like clarity emerging from the fog. It feels like certainty and wisdom emerging from behind the curtain, even if, or perhaps because, she refuses to support that feeling with reason and logic. Impressionism lasts because its message of facts not being enough resonates deeply with artistic types and those drawn into their orbits, as well it should. Conveying what factually is requires precision, but little creativity and skill. Conveying the impression something has on one is far more difficult and far more rewarding. It removes the artist from the vapid role of transcriber and elevates them into the roles of translator and interpreter. Impressionists recognize the poetic beauty in how the mind and spirit transform factual images into something that is sometimes more mournful, sometimes more joyous, and always more alive. This is another essay I had a difficult time conceiving and a more difficult time writing. I love pulling together what seem at first to be disparate parts into a whole that illuminates every element. It's challenging to do and cathartic to do right. I certainly hoped I managed to do this lunatic concept justice. Fitting 19th century France, my favorite novelist of all time, and an indie music legend into one video essay sounds insane even as I'm writing this outro. My greatest challenge in writing the script was identifying the proper structure for it. I asked myself, should I start with Virginia Woolf? Should I start with Carly Rae? Eventually, I decided to start on Impressionism as a general movement and build out to the specifics. I kept delaying this video because I feared it wouldn't come out right, but I think I managed to shed light on a variety of topics without making my central argument unfocused. Contemporary society considers ostensibly serious topics like Impressionism and Virginia Woolf to be on a completely different side of the artistic universe from ostensibly silly topics like Carly Rae Jepsen. But the greatest illusion in the world is the illusion of separation. In our lionization of icons like Virginia Woolf, we've eroded from popular consciousness the idea that they can be hilarious and passionate, in addition to being erudite and nuanced and achingly poignant. So by fusing supposed low culture with supposed high culture, I've tried to erase two illusions. The first being that the latter is detached from everyday experience, and the second being that the former is not worthy of study. Anyway, if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more impressionistic content. Also, don't forget to like and comment and subscribe, all that emotional stuff. Adios, comrades!